first two bosses down. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I just want to note really quickly, if you use Detect Magic on Sartura, it'll show you when she's in Whirlwind state, so it'll be easy to time the stun right after Whirlwind. Just a quick note.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I haven't seen that. That Detect Magic, it'll tell you like before she starts the Whirlwind, and she'll still be stunnable.
I believe it shows like a buff on her, like when you detect magic on other mobs.
Okay. So
yeah, sorry.
The Whirlwind's not like very visible.
Okay. All right. So we will definitely keep that in mind. All right. So after Sartura, there is the Scarab Gauntlet. It's very similar to the Suppression Room in that you just have to keep moving and you kill a ton of trash while you're running through it. The number 2 on the map here is Sartura. Number 3 is Fankriss, the next boss, and this long hallway in between is the Scarab Gauntlet. There's big blue guys, the soldiers, and then there's little brown guys, the drones, and you need to constantly be moving. They've got about a 20-second respawn timer. They don't have a ton of HP. I don't think this part is going to be particularly difficult, but I thought it was a part of note. The unfortunate part about this room is that you will have to clear it again if you wipe it deeper in the instance, because most of it will probably be respawned before you fight Fankriss. Although I believe once you've cleared it the second time, it won't respawn once Fankriss is dead. So, nice little Scarab Gauntlet. Kind of annoying if you're running back, but once you get to the end of the Scarab Gauntlet, you are going to face Fankriss the Unyielding. And Fankriss requires 2 tanks to tank the boss and 2 tanks to tank the ads. The primary ability that the boss has is a Mortal Wound. It's a stackable debuff that reduces healing by 10% for every stack. The important thing to note is that it's a cleave, so the off tank needs to make sure that they're behind the boss with the DPS so that they don't get stacks on them as well. Once the debuff gets to 4 or 5 stacks, depending on what the healers feel comfortable with, the off tank will swap, wait for the stacks to fall off the main tank, and then they can swap back as needed. The boss himself is just kind of a tank and spank. He stands there, you beat the shit out of him. The part of the fight that's semi-difficult is he summons a bunch of worms. They're called Spawns of Fankriss, and they spawn periodically. There's 3 little kind of alcoves in the room where worms and bugs can spawn. And these worms, they spawn 1 to 3 at a time, and they need to be DPS down very quickly because after 20 seconds they will one-shot whoever they hit. They'll one-shot tanks, they'll one-shot anybody. So they need to be absolute priority once they come out. The lucky thing is that the worms only have 33k HP, which is pretty low. So we, with a full raid worth of DPS nuking those things, they should be dead in seconds. The other mechanic that he has is Entangle, where he teleports the player to one of those 3 spawn caves, and a bunch of little bugs, I think it's 4 or 5 little hatchlings spawn. The healers will need to pay attention to who is entangled, because they'll take constant damage while they are near the bug spawn. They'll be rooted, they'll be taking damage, and if an off tank isn't quick enough and picks up the bugs will probably start hitting them too. So Fankriss is mostly the thing that's going to wipe you on Fankriss is if the worms enrage and start nuking people. So you just got to be you just have to be aware when the bugs come out. They spawn on a timer, and you just got to make sure you're killing them. Other than that, the boss is tauntable. The worms are tauntable. They become immune to taunt once they're enraged, but the goal is to make sure that they do not get enraged. Fankriss himself has about 1 million HP, which is the same amount of HP as Rag, but there is much less moving around than Rag, so he should go down faster. Think like, I believe Firemaw and Ebonrock, or not Firemaw, Ebonrock and Flamegore have about 1 million HP, so When the whole raid is standing still, nuking something, 1,000,000 HP disappears pretty quickly.
Mortal Wound is a debuff ability that Fankriss places on the main tank in the form of a cleave effect. It reduces healing received by 10% per stack, which is why it's important that the boss is faced away from the raid and tanks rotate as needed once the stacks start becoming too high on your main tank. During the fight, waves of hatchlings will spawn from the 3 bug tunnels inside of the room. Your raid will need 1 or 2 off tanks to pick them up using abilities that generate AoE threat, such as Battle Shout or Demo Shout, and keep them held in place until your raid leader calls for them to be cleared, or when the damage starts becoming too high for your tanks to handle. Entangle is a periodic ability where a random player will be teleported to a nearby bug tunnel and trapped for the duration. This ability happens during a new wave of hatchlings, and it's important that healers are observant so that players are not killed by the newly spawned scarabs. Spawns of Fankriss will be the biggest danger in this encounter due to their enrage mechanic. Coming in waves of 1 to 3 during the fight, your DPS should focus on killing these within 10 to 15 seconds because shortly afterward, they will enrage. Once enraged, they will start one-shotting players in your raid group. Lastly, keep in mind that they are vulnerable to stun effects. Before getting into the raid positioning section, we need to first go over the safe spot that your raid will be in before engaging Fankriss. In 2006, the safe spot for the original version of AQ40 was located here, but due to various private servers adjusting his aggro range, the safe spot for your raid may instead be located here, or further back as in here. Depending on where you're playing vanilla or classic World of Warcraft, keep in mind that the safe spot location could be different in your experience. As the raid moves from the safe spot into the room, it's important that the tank turns Fankriss around, with the rest of the raid stacking on his tail. In the back, 1 or 2 off tanks will hold the scarabs as they spawn during the fight. DPS players will focus on burning Fankriss down while switching the snakes as they spawn. Healers will focus on their healing assignments while keeping an eye on the bug tunnels to make sure that any entangled players are not in danger. And then finally, another tank should be prepared to switch out with the main tank once his debuff stacks start becoming too high. Moving into the room from the safe spot as our tank works on positioning the boss, the first wave of hatchlings spawn as I also notice one of our players become entangled nearby. As the rest of the raid starts stacking on the boss's tail, the off tank at the same time works on gathering the scarabs together. Due to the mortal wound stacks on the main tank, another tank moves in and takes over just as the first spawn of Fankriss arrives. Keep in mind that these guys hit hard even when not enraged, so try to kill them within a 10 to 15 second window. Quickly taking it down, the raid leader calls for AoE and we clear the scarabs out to give us some much needed space. As for the boss himself, he's mostly tank and spank, which allows our DPS players to go all out when not dealing with any snakes. The second spawn of Fankriss arrives alone with a new wave of hatchlings before being stunned and killed, just as another snake arrives. As the fight goes on, it generally becomes a matter of just being aware to your surroundings, identifying any newly spawned snakes, and then bursting them down. Aside from that, Fankriss is a very simple fight that is mostly reliant on your raid just creating an efficient kill order when it comes to the scarabs, snakes, and the boss himself. In this clip, we luckily didn't have any crazy snake spawns, but your experience could be different, as it is possible to get 2 or 3 at the same time, and that can be a challenge to deal with.
Alright, so that's Fankriss. The name of the game with him is really making sure that those worms don't stay alive for very long, and that the tanks are communicating and getting their swaps efficiently. He's mostly tank and spank, just with a little bit of extra ads. The other thing that he noted in the video was the safe spot. Fankriss has a gigantic aggro radius. When you enter his room, he pretty much starts running after you. So it's going to be kind of a, you want to be in a good position when you finish the Scarab Gauntlet, because the Scarab Gauntlet opens right into his room. Hopefully the safe spot from the original classic is still the same as he noted in the video, but if it's not a huge deal. You'll just kind of kill some scarabs, and I'm sure the tanks will be asking to beat up some scarabs anyway so they can get some rage while the healers drink up and all that fun stuff. So that is Fankriss. So on to Princess Huhuran. All right.
Real quick,
Yep, go ahead.
is the entangled dispellable or is it
It is not dispellable. You just got to heal through it.
fair enough?
Yep. I think it lasts like 8 or 10 seconds, something like that. It doesn't last too long.
And the entangle itself doesn't necessarily. Is it the entangled that deals damage, or is it just that the?
I
Scarab
think the
coming out to you?
entangle
I don't-
does damage, and the scarabs can hit you for more damage.
Okay.
I believe like the entangle does a minor amount of damage over time.
Can you stun the snakes?
Yes, you can stun the snakes as long as they're not enraged. So keeping them stun locked is a good strategy because they do hit relatively hard if they're not tanked, and a mage or somebody gets aggro from AoEing. You definitely want to keep those things stunned if the tank hasn't gotten good aggro on it. All right, so on to Princess Huhuran. Huhuran is a tricky fight in that you need a lot of outside of raid preparation in order to take her down. Everybody should be bringing greater nature protection potions. This is the boss that you really, really need them for. Everybody for progression should have a few stacks of these saved up and should be popping them once at the start of the fight and once they can pop it again during the rest of the fight. As most of you probably know, we need 15 soakers with 200 plus nature resistance. Our DPS warriors, our hunters, our rogues, our enhancement shamans. Our tanks are exempt from this because they need to have as much threat gear on as possible so that we can kill Huhuran as quickly as possible. So we are going to be having 2 tanks tanking the boss. They are going to be trading off because she has an ability called Acid Spit that stacks a nature damage dot on the tanks. Once it gets too high, they will swap. The boss is immune to taunt, so you guys are going to need to be kind of fighting back and forth and making sure that main tank and off tank stay nice and high on the meters. Her other abilities that she has during the fight are Wyvern Sting. It's an AoE sleep. It's very similar to the ability that the Shadow Hunters and ZG have, where it's a poison that hits 10 targets in melee range, and it does 3,000 damage to them if they get dispelled. So you only want to be dispelling the tanks when this happens, and the other melee, you want to leave them for the effect to fall off so they don't take damage. She has a frenzy that will happen periodically throughout the fight that will increase her attack damage and attack speed, and needs to be trank shotted by the hunters. So I believe 2 hunters is enough to trank her frenzy, 3 for a backup, but the hunters are going to need to make sure that they are balancing nature resist along with their hit gear to make sure that they are capped and they're not missing trank shots, because missing a trank shot on this fight can be devastating. Her other ability is an Enrage that goes off when she's at 30% health. It increases her attack speed and attack damage by quite a bit, and she begins casting 2k damage poison bolts every 3 seconds on the closest 15 people. This is why our 15 soakers are all melee, because they have to be within melee range, and they need to mitigate as much of these poison bolts as possible. They go off very quickly, and they do a lot of damage. At this point in the fight, once she gets to 30%, it's going to be on the range DPS to pop all their cooldowns. The melee DPS is going to be a little gimped because they have all their nature resist on, but they'll pop their cooldowns, and everybody's goal is to just burn the boss down as quickly as possible. If one of the soakers goes down, it'll start a chain reaction where somebody who's not wearing nature resist gear is going to get hit, and then they go down, and then another soaker goes down, and then healers start getting hit, and it's pretty bad if your soakers go down. So the goal with this fight is to be prepared with our nature resist. make sure that you're over prepared rather than under prepared. It would really suck to not be able to do this fight because we didn't have enough nature resist. And if it turns out that the damage isn't so bad and the healers are able to heal through it, then we can kind of start taking off some nature resist pieces and putting our DPS pieces back on and killing the boss much faster. So Huhuran has about 1 million HP. It's the same amount of HP as Rag and Flame Gore, Ebon Rock, Fire Maw. So the nice thing about Huhuran is that it's an entirely stationary fight. Nobody needs to be running around, so you're going to be able to just stand there and DPS the hell out of her. The only other ability that she has that I haven't mentioned yet is this Noxious Poison. It's a nature damage dot that silences the target, and it spreads to nearby players, and it can't be dispelled. So it's very important that the ranged are spread out. I think it was like jumps like 10 or 12 yards, something like that. But you need to make sure you're spread out so you don't cause a chain reaction and silence all the healers and or silence all the DPS during the enrage phase. So it's very important you stay spread out. But there's very little movement in this fight, so that should not be a problem.
Frenzy is a periodic buff that Huhuran gains during the fight, which increases her attack speed and causes her to start casting waves of poison bolts after several seconds. Hunters can remove this effect by using tranquilizing shots and make sure that a rotation is set up before the fight begins. Poison Bolt is Huhuran's signature ability that deals roughly 2000 nature damage to the closest 15 players. This ability only occurs when her health reaches 30% or when she is frenzied. Acid Spit is a damage over time effect that Huhuran casts in the main tank that deals 219 to 281 damage per stack every 2 seconds. Because of this ability, it is advised that during progression, your tanks rotate when their stacks start becoming too high. DPS players will need to stay below the 2 tanks when it comes to threat during the fight. Once AQ40 is on farm status, your raid can transition from 2 tanks to 1 for a higher threat ceiling. Vibrant Sting is an area of effect spell that Huhuran will cast on 10 targets in her melee range, including pets. Players affected by this spell will be put to sleep for the duration, and it's important that this effect is not cleansed as it will inflict roughly 3000 nature damage to the target. Noxious Poison is a damage over time effect that deals roughly 2900 nature damage over 8 seconds to a random player while also silencing them for the duration. This ability will also spread to nearby players, so make sure to watch your spacing. Lastly, this debuff cannot be cleansed. At 30% health, Huhuran will berserk, increasing her attack speed, but most importantly she will start unleashing poison bolt volleys at a much faster rate. At this point in the fight, it will be a DPS race to kill her before she kills your raid. Utilizing your most powerful cooldowns and remaining consumables will be crucial in quickly ending the fight. Before moving on to the next section, we need to discuss the nature resistance requirements that your raid will need for this boss encounter. Due to the Poison Bolt's ability that we discussed earlier, your raid will need 15 players to shield the rest of the raid group during the final stretch of the fights when the boss's health reaches 30%. These 15 players will consist of your warriors, rogues, and also hunters if needed. With that said, let's start getting into the details of a melee player's perspective in this encounter. Tanks during this fight should focus on armor, defense, and health over nature resistance due to Poison Bolt damage not occurring to the last 30% of this fight, as long as your hunters are removing Frenzy properly. At the same time, Acid Spit cannot be resisted, and due to this debuff, it is advised to have tank rotations in place for progression raids. Finally, keep in mind that this boss is immune to all forms of taunt. DPS warriors and rogues will need to push for 200 nature resistance unbuffed, however, more is always better as the only damage you should receive in this fight is from the Poison Bolt volley. Melee DPS players shouldn't worry about their damage, but instead on survivability since their role in this fight will be shielding the raid, while caster DPS carry the tail end of the fight. Depending on your guild roster, hunters may be needed to help soak the damage during the berserk phase, which means that they should focus on building an NR set as well. Finally, don't forget to take advantage of aspects of the wild which provides party members with an aura, increasing their nature resistance by 60. As the encounter starts, the main tank should position the boss directly in the center of the room. Healers and ranged DPS will need to spread out to avoid spreading noxious poison, while your 15 soakers consisting of warriors, rogues, and possibly hunters will need to stack on Huhuran in a tight ball and be closer to her than anyone else in the raid. Once AQ40 is on farm status, you'll be able to transition from 2 tanks to only 1 tank for the entire duration of the fight. For this week's raid perspective segment, I'll be showing you guys one of my earliest AQ40 raids when the content was still fresh to capture some of that progression feeling compared to previous videos. With the boss positioned in the middle of the room and the raid spreading out, I start my DPS rotation while keeping an eye on KTM so I can watch my threat and stay below the 2 tanks. If you look to the right, a lot of healers are very close together, which presents a dangerous situation if they were to get hit by noxious poison, so make sure that your raid is spread out much more than we are. At this point, you can see Frenzy being activated on the boss before a hunter uses tranquilizing shots to quickly remove it, while the melee DPS are slept due to Wyvern Sting. By this point, we've already covered the majority of this boss's abilities, while others, such as Acid Spit, only affect the current tank, and Poison Bolt Volley should never occur until the Berserk phase. The most important thing about this fight for progression is pacing your raid to be within that 5-minute window of killing her, and also surviving the final stretch of the fight that begins at 30%. Because this was one of our earliest AQ40 raids, a lot of our caster DPS are holding back on damage until she berserks at 30%, since it creates a threat buffer for us. At the same time, I think that players, including myself, are a bit more cautious or conservative during the first couple of weeks of new content, due to learning the mechanics and seeing how far we can push our limits. While the main tank is able to stay in for a long period of time during this fight, remember that your situation may be different, and depending on the gear of your tank, you may need to do a switch earlier. With over 3 minutes left until she enrages, our raid is pacing itself accordingly as the second tank prepares to switch off with the main tank at 36%. Keep in mind that if your tanks are having issues switching, then you can always have a paladin use Blessing of Protection on the main tank to temporarily drop his aggro. Or you can also use a limited invulnerability potion as well. As we head toward the conclusion of the fight, this is the most important part, as your caster DPS will need to use all of their available cooldowns to carry the fight, while the soakers focus on surviving the Poison Bolt Volley. But with proper gear and consumables, your raid will be successful in the end, allowing you to move on to the next boss encounter.
Huhuran. The big deal with Huhuran is going to be that enrage phase and making sure that you can soak the nature damage. She's remembered as one of the harder bosses in AQ, or kind of a stopping point for most guilds. I think if we're prepared with nature protection potions and a suitable amount of nature resistance gear, that Huhuran's not going to be a big problem. She's got 1 million health. We put out a ton of DPS, and I think she will go down relatively easily. The other thing that he mentioned in the video is that the tanks won't necessarily have to swap depending on how well the healers are doing with the stacking debuff and how quickly the DPS are able to get the boss down. So we'll kind of have to gauge that and see how we're doing as we get in there. I think we were planning on using 2 tanks, but it'll kind of depend on how much damage the tank is taking over time, and if it appears to be an issue, whether or not we'll try to work the tank swap in there. But that's Huhuran. So moving on